this episode, we start by taking the pressure out of the phrase risk response, because new learners often think risk response means finding the safest possible option every time, even if that option makes a project impossible. In privacy engineering, risk response is the disciplined process of choosing what to do about a known privacy risk in a way that protects individuals while still allowing the organization to operate, deliver products, and meet legitimate goals. The CDPSE exam expects you to understand that privacy work is full of trade-offs, and that maturity is shown by making those trade-offs explicitly, documenting them, and implementing controls that keep residual risk within defined tolerance. Balancing privacy, delivery, and business reality does not mean sacrificing privacy whenever someone says the project is urgent. It means selecting responses that are proportionate to the risk and defensible given obligations and expectations. When you are new, it helps to remember that risk response is not a single control, but a set of choices that connect assessment to action and action to evidence. The exam often tests whether you can choose a response that matches both the type of risk and the type of processing, rather than using one favorite answer everywhere. By the end, you should be able to explain the main response options, how to select between them, and how to keep the response repeatable and accountable under real-world constraints. A solid foundation is understanding what makes a response decision necessary in the first place, because privacy risk response begins only after risk has been identified and understood. Risk identification tells you what could go wrong and why, while risk response is the decision about what you will do to reduce the chance or impact of harm, or whether you will proceed with the risk under defined conditions. The exam expects you to connect response to the nature of harm, such as exposure of sensitive personal information, unfair profiling, misuse beyond purpose, or inability to honor rights. A beginner misunderstanding is thinking response is only a technical choice, but privacy risk often requires a mix of design changes, process controls, vendor controls, and communication changes. Another misunderstanding is treating response as a debate between privacy and business, when in mature programs privacy requirements are part of business reality, not external obstacles. A response decision also depends on the organization's risk appetite and policies, because some risks cannot be accepted without leadership approval, and some processing must be avoided because it violates obligations. This is why documentation and approval paths matter so much, because they make decisions defensible and consistent. When you frame response as a structured decision, you reduce the emotional tone that can creep into privacy discussions and instead focus on evidence and outcomes. Most privacy risk responses can be understood through 4 classic options, and while programs may use different terms, the exam is testing the logic behind them rather than the exact labels. Mitigate means you change the design, controls, or process to reduce risk, such as collecting less data, limiting access, improving transparency, or enforcing retention limits. Avoid means you do not proceed with a processing activity because the risk is too high or the activity cannot be made compatible with obligations and principles. Transfer means you shift some responsibilities or costs through contracts or other mechanisms, such as requiring vendors to provide safeguards and evidence. But transfer does not eliminate accountability and must be paired with oversight. Accept means you proceed with residual risk after controls are applied, documenting why the risk is acceptable and who approved it, often with monitoring requirements. A common beginner mistake is assuming mitigation is always possible and always sufficient, but some risks are inherent to the nature of the processing, such as collecting highly sensitive data for a non-essential purpose. Another mistake is assuming acceptance is always wrong, when acceptance can be appropriate for low risks or for situations where the benefit is legitimate and controls reduce risk sufficiently. The exam often presents choices that include these options in disguise, and your job is to select the one that fits the scenario's obligations, harm potential, and practical constraints. When you can describe these options in plain terms, you gain a stable toolkit for scenario reasoning. Mitigation is the most common response, but it is also where beginners can become unfocused because there are many possible controls and it is easy to propose generic fixes. In privacy engineering, strong mitigation is specific and connected to the risk mechanism. If the risk is excessive data collection, mitigation should focus on minimization, such as removing fields, limiting frequency, or using less precise data. If the risk is inappropriate use, mitigation should focus on purpose limitation, such as restricting processing to defined purposes and implementing review gates for new uses. If the risk is unauthorized access, mitigation should focus on access controls, least privilege, monitoring, and audit trails. If the risk is vendor exposure, mitigation should focus on contracts, minimization of shared data, processing location controls, and ongoing oversight. If the risk is unfair outcomes from poor data quality, mitigation should include accuracy controls, validation, and human review processes where needed. The exam expects you to think this way because it distinguishes a mature response from a vague promise to improve security. Another key mitigation concept is privacy-friendly defaults, because defaults shape behavior at scale and can reduce risk without requiring users to understand complex settings. Mitigation should also include evidence planning, meaning you can show that the control is in place and operating, not just intended. When mitigation is targeted and evidenced, it becomes a defensible response that supports delivery rather than delaying it endlessly. Avoidance is the response many learners hesitate to choose because it sounds extreme, yet the exam expects you to recognize when avoidance is the responsible option. Avoidance is appropriate when the processing cannot be made compatible with obligations, when potential harm is too high relative to the purpose, or when required safeguards cannot be implemented in time without unacceptable risk. For example, collecting sensitive personal information for a purpose that is not necessary and cannot be justified under the organization's policies may require the organization to stop or redesign the feature. Avoidance can also be appropriate when an organization cannot honor rights or transparency obligations for a proposed processing activity because data flows are too opaque or vendors cannot support required actions. Another situation is when the proposed use is incompatible with what individuals were told, and obtaining proper consent or updating transparency in a meaningful way is not feasible. The exam may test this by offering mitigation steps that do not actually address the core incompatibility, and the correct answer may involve stopping the activity until a lawful and ethical approach is possible. Beginners sometimes think avoidance means the business loses, but in mature governance, avoiding a high-risk activity can protect the business by preventing incidents, reputational damage, and regulatory consequences. Avoidance can also be framed as redesign, meaning the organization changes the plan to achieve the goal with less data or a different processing approach. When you choose avoidance, the key is to connect it to risk tolerance and obligations, showing it is not arbitrary but defensible. Transfer is often misunderstood in privacy contexts because learners sometimes assume transferring risk to a vendor means the organization is no longer responsible. In privacy engineering, transfer can reduce exposure or shift certain operational duties, but accountability for obligations usually remains, especially when the organization is the party deciding the purpose of processing. Transfer often shows up through vendor contracts, insurance, or shared responsibility models and hosted services, but the organization must still perform due diligence and oversight to ensure the transferred responsibilities are actually carried out. The exam may test this by describing a vendor that claims compliance and asking what the organization should do, where mature answers include verifying controls, enforcing contract terms, and monitoring. Transfer can also involve using specialized service providers for functions like secure storage or identity verification, which can reduce risk if the provider has strong controls, but only if the organization integrates the service correctly and limits data sharing to what is necessary. Another important point is that transfer can create new risks, such as additional data sharing or cross-border processing. So transfer decisions must include assessment of the vendor's data flows and subprocessors. In practice, transfer is most effective when paired with mitigation, such as minimizing data shared and requiring evidence of safeguards. When you treat transfer as controlled outsourcing with oversight rather than as dumping responsibility, you align with what the exam expects. Acceptance is the response that most clearly demonstrates governance maturity when it is done correctly, because it shows the organization can make explicit, documented decisions about residual risk. Acceptance is appropriate when risk is low or when the risk has been mitigated to a level consistent with the organization's tolerance, and when the remaining risk is understood and monitored. The exam expects you to recognize that acceptance is not ignoring risk, because ignoring risk lacks documentation and oversight, while acceptance requires explicit approval, rationale, and often conditions. A mature acceptance record includes the nature of the risk, the controls in place, what residual risk remains, why the organization believes it is acceptable, who approved it, and when it will be reviewed. Acceptance also often includes monitoring requirements, such as checking metrics, reviewing access logs, or revisiting the decision after a change in scope or regulation. Beginners sometimes fear acceptance because they equate it with negligence, but in real programs, not every risk can be reduced to zero, and acceptance is how organizations operate responsibly while acknowledging reality. The exam may test acceptance by presenting a scenario where mitigation is already strong and further mitigation would be disproportionate, and the best choice may be to accept residual risk with documentation and monitoring. Acceptance must be bounded, meaning it applies under certain conditions, and if those conditions change, the decision must be revisited. When acceptance is bounded and documented, it becomes a defensible part of risk management rather than a loophole. Balancing privacy, delivery, and business reality depends on proportionality, which means the response effort and control strength should match the level of risk and the nature of the processing. Proportionality does not mean weak controls for convenience. It means using the least intrusive and most effective controls that achieve privacy outcomes without unnecessary friction. For low-risk processing, light controls and simplified documentation may be sufficient, while high-risk processing may require formal assessments, stronger safeguards, and leadership approvals. The exam expects you to think in proportionality because it is one of the main ways privacy programs remain sustainable. If everything requires maximum rigor, teams will bypass the process, and the program becomes ineffective. Proportionality also supports fairness, because similar processing should receive similar scrutiny, and different processing should be treated differently for good reasons. Another key factor is timing, because early mitigation is often easier and cheaper than late mitigation, and the exam frequently rewards choices that embed privacy earlier rather than patching later. Proportionality also intersects with transparency, because individuals should not be surprised by processing, and reducing surprise through clear communication can be part of the response. When you balance correctly, privacy becomes part of delivery rather than an obstacle to it. Choosing the right response also depends on understanding the business objective clearly, because unclear objectives lead to overly broad data collection and unnecessary risk. A common privacy engineering move is to ask what the minimum data and minimum processing needed are to achieve the goal, then redesign to fit that minimum. This can be a powerful mitigation that also supports delivery, because smaller scope is often easier to implement and operate. The exam may test this by offering response options that reduce data scope or limit purposes rather than adding complex controls on top of broad collection. Another design-based response is using staged releases, where a feature is launched with minimal data collection first, then expanded only after controls and monitoring prove the approach is safe and useful. This can balance delivery pressures with privacy risk reduction by avoiding risky leaps. Business reality also includes operational capacity, meaning an organization must be able to honor rights and respond to incidents for the processing it introduces, and if it cannot, the responsible response may involve delaying launch or redesigning data flows. Beginners sometimes think privacy always says no, but many privacy responses are about refining objectives and reducing unnecessary complexity. When you treat business objectives as inputs to privacy design rather than as opposing forces, you can choose responses that satisfy both privacy and delivery needs. Evidence is an essential part of risk response because the exam is not only testing whether you can pick a response type, but whether you can prove the response was implemented and is working. Mitigation requires evidence like updated notices, access control configurations, monitoring records, retention schedules, and training completion tied to new workflows. Transfer requires evidence like contract terms, due diligence records, vendor monitoring, and incident and rights cooperation performance. Acceptance requires evidence of documented approval, rationale, and review scheduling. Avoidance requires evidence that the risky processing was not implemented or that the plan was redesigned, along with updated documentation and communication if plans changed. Evidence also supports audit and learning, because without evidence, the organization cannot show consistency across projects or improve based on what works. The exam may test this by presenting response options that sound good but lack evidence, and mature answers include documentation, ownership, and monitoring. Evidence planning should be part of the response decision, not an afterthought, because a response that cannot be evidenced is a response that cannot be defended. Another important point is that evidence should be proportional, because overly complex evidence burdens teams and leads to noncompliance, while insufficient evidence fails audits. When you connect response to evidence, you show the maturity the exam is designed to measure. As we close, choosing risk responses that balance privacy, delivery, and business reality means making disciplined, proportional decisions that reduce harm while enabling legitimate goals, and then documenting and verifying those decisions so accountability remains real. Mitigation, avoidance, transfer, and acceptance are the core response options, and each one has a place when selected based on the nature of the risk, the sensitivity and scale of personal information, the obligations and principles in play, and the organization's defined risk tolerance. Mitigation is strongest when it targets the risk mechanism through minimization, purpose limitation, access controls, retention discipline, vendor controls, and evidence planning rather than generic promises. Avoidance is responsible when processing cannot be made compatible with obligations or when potential harm is too high, often leading to redesign as a practical alternative. Transfer works when vendor and partner responsibilities are controlled through due diligence, enforceable contracts, and ongoing monitoring rather than assumed away. Acceptance is mature when residual risk is understood, approved, bounded, and monitored, not ignored, and it supports sustainable operations in the real world. The CDPSE exam rewards this domain because privacy engineering is ultimately about making defensible choices under constraints, and when you can explain how to select, implement, and evidence a balanced risk response, you demonstrate repeatable risk management maturity.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.